available for later viewing. Good morning and welcome to our Projects and Payments series in collaboration with FCMAT. This is part 2 of our series, To Pay or Not to Pay, looking at contractor payment requirements in the coronavirus era. My name is Kelly Owens. I am a partner at F3 Law, and I'm also co-chair of the Business Facilities and Real Estate Practice Group here at F3. And I am thrilled to be joined today again by Mike Fine, the Chief Executive Officer at FCMAT, who you will hear from in just a moment. And again, just with part 1, if you attended that last one, we have 2 primary goals here, and both relate to just giving you some practical guidance in this time of uncertainty. First, we want to give you an idea of the framework and recommendations that we as attorneys are providing to clients as you make some tough decisions around your contracts and your payments in this period of time. And then also we wanted to give you the latest on the fiscal realities facing our school districts. And because the funding issues tie so closely to what we're going to talk about today on payments. And because of that, I'd like to kick it now to Mike Fine, who's going to give you the latest on the fiscal outlook. Mike?
Thank you. Good morning, Kelly, and good morning to everybody. I'm not going to go back through in any detail the slide that I covered last week, but I do want to point out for those of you that have not seen the news this morning, the Department of Finance did release their preliminary estimates for tax receipts for the next 12 months. That includes this year and includes next year. And by no surprise, those tax receipts have been heavily impacted by COVID-19. These are preliminary numbers.
Mike, I think you're freezing just a bit. You may want to temporarily turn off the video.
Thank you, Kelly. So this morning's news announcements ahead of next week's May revised certainly begin to give you some data that you can work from in understanding the magnitude of the cuts that we're going to be facing. We now have estimates, and these are all preliminary because we won't have actual numbers till mid-July, but we're looking at roughly $9 billion of impact in the current year between now and June 30th, and another $32 billion for next year. And as you all understand how Proposition 98 works, we get a percentage of the state budget. And as tax revenues go up, we get a percentage of those increases. And as tax revenues go down, we share in a percentage of those. And so today's news is certainly sobering. It's not unexpected. They're not at levels, frankly, we didn't expect. I would remind everybody, as you look at newspaper articles on it, or even actually read the Department of Finance's letter, that you understand that the impacts to Proposition 98 are the gross impacts. They are just purely a mathematical calculation based on an estimate. They are before political solutions are provided. They are before cash deferrals are made. They're before any available, if you will, tricks of the trade can be done. That may bring that number down a little bit. But we're talking about roughly an $18 billion impact to Prop 98 for the next fiscal year, starting July 1. And that's in the double-digit deficit factor range, just to put it into perspective. So good information to have, not good news, but good information, and that allows you to further plan, but would guide each of you to these links that are on this slide here on the FCMAT webpage, fcmat.org. We have a COVID-19 resource page, and we have issued several fiscal alerts related to COVID-19, one around cash management and one around planning budget scenarios. And both of those are consistent advice and consistent best practices with even the news that's out today from Sacramento with respect to those estimated cuts. Thanks, Kelly.
All right, thank you. And those are both fantastic pieces. And so we will put these slides up on our website and also push it out to those registered. And so you will have these links as part of the slides to connect to. And I also, as Mike was talking, see some questions coming in already. And just like last time, we're going to continue to put your questions in the chat box. Given the amount of content we have today in the short time period, we'll try to get to a few at the end. If not, we're continuing to gather questions for an FAQ piece that we're developing. We already have lots of great questions from part 1, and part 2, I'm sure we'll have more to add. And that piece will be put out later, along with a recording of the webinar and our materials as well. So keep your questions coming and we will check those out. So really as Mike was talking about and the fiscal outlook, you're also at the same time not only looking at budget, but you're also looking at how are we paying our contractors right now? What are our obligations, particularly given some of the guidance that is out there? And really the basis for a lot of challenges we're facing right now and school districts are facing is due to the continued shutdown. And it really turns on the executive orders that the governor has put out, as well as some laws that we'll talk about. It goes back to Executive Order N33-20, and that's the order that directed most individuals to shelter in place. And it does have a few exceptions, one of which we talked about last time is exceptions for workers that are doing public works projects. And we talked about last time how those projects can continue and your essential projects can continue as long as you're looking at them critically and communicating with your vendors. The same really holds true for what we're covering today as far as communication and just really using some common sense in evaluating whether or not you should be paying contractors and how much, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. But really for the purposes of today, we're focusing on contractor payments. And what we mean by that is payments under existing contracts, many of which you entered into before all of this happened. And really we're talking about contractors and not employees in this context. That's probably the subject of many other presentations and for another day, but that's really the focus of today. And also Mike gave you some news on what's to come in the fiscal outlook, but really we're making these decisions now with the information we have on the funding that we have right now. And so we're going to focus on decision making based on what you're looking at in your funds at the moment, but that could be subject to change. And along with the executive orders, we have 2 new laws to navigate that talk about payments and include language on payments to contractors. So the first one is our state law, SB 117. We talked about a little bit about this the last time, but really it's the state law that was passed recently to ensure that school districts can continue to get their funding even during the closures, and particularly around your ADA apportionment. And with that language though, and ordering those payments to continue despite being closed, the SB 117 also speaks to this obligation, or at least the general intent of the law is that employees and contractors should be compensated by LEAs while a school is closed due to COVID-19. And it includes this additional language, which we'll cover a little bit more, that basically says you should do this as reasonably anticipated if the school had not been closed due to COVID-19. And that's really where a lot of the debate is coming. Before I move on to the federal law, Mike, do you have anything to add there on SB 117?
Not specifically. However, I think as you've alluded to, timing's important. SB 117 deals with the current year up to June 30th. And so that's why Kelly focuses on the comments about current funds and current contracts and so on. It's not necessarily applicable once we get to July 1. It was this general concept of the state's going to hold schools ADA harmless during the COVID-19 impact, and therefore funding would continue to flow. Therefore, school districts should ensure that funding from them to their partners, employees and vendor partners and others, continue to flow as well. So I would emphasize that. And as Kelly alluded to last week and again this morning, the term contractors here is used very broadly. It's not just public works folks, it's the state's term for basically non-employees. So that would cover non-public schools, non-public agencies, your independent contractors and consultants that you may work with. Those kinds of folks are broadly considered in this guidance.
Mm-hmm. And same shifting to the federal law, the CARES Act, which we covered last time, has very similar language and structure to it. It refers to both payments to employees and contractors. And in the federal context, this bill is really tied to the $13.5 billion that's going to be made available for schools to ensure that it's really called the Education Stabilization Fund, and it's going to help ensure that local agencies can continue to operate. But as part of that bill, they include this language, and it, similar to SB 117, it says it's, the intent is to continue to pay employees and contractors during the periods of any disruptions and closures due to COVID-19. So similar structure to that, but again, we have that language in there of to the greatest extent practicable. And so you give that kind of language to attorneys, and there is some debate there. But really, given how similar the state and federal laws are, there are some key takeaways. The intent is overall to just keep people employed and keep cash flow going. And that was the basis for this language in the bill. So just like with our essential projects we talked about last time, the general intent is that these projects and payments continue to the extent possible. But of course, and continue to contractors, as Mike pointed out, we have to read that pretty broadly. But with knowing that, though, there is still room for discretion, and from a school district perspective. And we mean discretion in your local area due to your circumstances in front of you. What is practicable when we look at the law? What is within your discretion or your considerations as to whether or not you make those payments? But in general, the idea is to continue payments where possible. Now, I know that's pretty nuanced, and that's a lot of legal to throw at you right away. So now we're going to shift a little bit more into the practical side and some of our recommendations that Mike and I have talked about in terms of looking at your current contracts, both on the public works side and service contracts, which there are some distinctions that we'll talk about, and determining whether or not you pay. And it is really a balance. And why I say that it's a balance is I think right now there's certainly a sentiment and a desire as public entities to want to work with our vendors, and that certainly continues, and that you want to do the right thing. And we want to be on the right side of this when we look back and see how we all navigated this situation. But at the same time, just like Mike was sharing with the budget considerations, districts are going to be facing some really tough fiscal times. And so we want to make sure that there is, when you're reviewing these contracts and determining whether or not to pay your contractors, we want to make sure there's a pretty rigorous review of some of the other factors to make sure we're still adhering to our duty of fiscal responsibility, especially as we see what could potentially be coming forward. And so we'll hit on each one of these in detail, but the first one is one that's a little bit of a spoiler alert on our side of things. So if you call an F3 attorney on one of these issues, contractor, to pay or not to pay, should I pay my contractor? The spoiler alert is there's going to be one key question that we ask you. And well, really there'll be two. First is going to be, how are you doing in all of this? And then the second one is going to be, well, what does your contract say? And we've come up with a list of a few different key terms that we've seen in a lot of these contracts that we're reviewing that I just want to touch on briefly. One of the biggest ones, and we spoke to this when we talked about our essential projects in the public works side, is what are your timelines? What timelines have slipped a bit because of this issue, and what timelines are absolutely necessary that you get things done. Another one that I wanted to pull out is look at your contract and what type of contract is it in terms of your payment requirements. Do you pay on a month-to-month basis where it's just a set fee every month, or do you pay by service, and as those services are performed or as those works are completed, you pay more? And that's going to be one of the determining factors in how we approach the payment situation. The other thing I wanted to touch on that we're seeing is, as much as we want to continue payments to vendors under these contracts, and as much as we want to keep that cash flow going in line with the intent of the statutes, We do recommend that you still look at your termination language in detail. There could be circumstances where you'll look at a relatively simple contract and it'll have termination for convenience. And what that means is, if the one party decides that it no longer wants to be in the contract, it usually can provide some certain advance notice and be done with the contract. And that's typically what we're recommending is a backup measure. Generally, we're saying try to work with your vendor, try to continue the payments as best you can, but to look to this termination language in case, for example, the contractor is not coming to the table or not negotiating. And then the other one we wanted to touch on, just because this term has been thrown out a lot out there, and that's force majeure. And that's something that's in pretty much every standard contract, or should be. And what it essentially means is it's a part of the contract that says if something crazy happens, if you get, if there's an emergency situation or something completely unforeseen happens during the course of this contract, we're going to give some relief to the parties from their obligations of the contract. And that has come into play in many situations because force majeure was somewhat designed for a situation like the coronavirus, where we don't see it coming. It results in completely unforeseen circumstances that no one could have predicted. And so many clients were having them look at their force majeure language to see how that impacts payment obligations and other duties under their contract. And what's interesting though is we are seeing, and you may be seeing it in your contracts, is surprisingly in those terms, epidemic or pandemic is already included in a lot of those. And so if it's in there, you're probably in a pretty good spot to at least be able to apply that force majeure language as part of your negotiation on payments. But one thing I wanted to point out, if you're looking at that language and potentially amending it for future or amending it to suit your current situation, one thing to think about is, does your force majeure language simply say in the case of epidemics, or does it cover more of the impacts from it? So for example, does it cover government closures due to this laundry list of items? Does it cover supply chain issues due to shutdowns? So there's ways to play with the language there, but it really is, don't just say epidemic, pandemic, say the effects arising from those events. And here, coronavirus would fall into a category like that. With respect to the contract itself, and this is something that Mike and I talked about repeatedly on the last call about documenting. And so before I jump into what our legal side recommendations are, I just wanted to turn it back to Mike to jump in on, Mike, what are your main recommendations for why we want, okay, any payment terms, any new obligations around these contracts that we're looking at, why do we need to document what we're doing from your perspective?
Great question, Kelly. I think there's several things, and as the slide begins, right at bullet 1, it's about having your governing board weigh in and understand what's going on as well. So documenting through some type of amendment to your contract or separate side agreement, memorandum of understanding, something that ties back to that original contract that your board's approving. First and foremost, you want to ensure that it meets the standard of essential services. And that's really in many respects left to your board to say this service XYZ is essential to us. And we talked about that last week. But the other practical issues of documenting as opposed to an agreement over the phone is when you go to pay and the payment terms are different than what your contract says, and that payment is selected by your county office for audit, you'll now have documentation to support an alternative payment term, and that will become very important. That way your payment won't be held up by the county office. It'll flow through in a very seamless process. The other issue, as you all know, is that you have independent auditors that come in and sample your transactions during the course of the year. And those independent auditors may sample one of these and say, wait, payments don't match terms. And then you end up with a finding in your audit report and questions around your internal controls. And so documentation is critical right from the beginning of recording what the agreement is, having the board consider that for a variety of purposes, and then working through kind of on the tail end of the process, support on the payment side of the house.
Mm-hmm. And expanding on that, Mike, the benefits of putting in writing whatever your new payment agreement is going to be, or even just the new understanding about what your contract says in light of this era is so important. And we've heard a couple of things from clients of questions, and really great questions regarding, all right, if we continue to pay this vendor and they're not giving us exactly the service that we were promised, is that a gift of public funds? And one way to help avoid challenges based on that is to have documentation that explains why the continued payments in this case support the public purpose. And it can be, reasons as much as we need to keep this construction project going because we're going to open a school in the fall, or it can be we need to keep paying this vendor or transportation company so that they are around when we need them and when we open back up, and we don't know exactly when that's going to be, but we know we're going to need those folks. So it's really around memorializing the why behind your decision so that you can avoid any claims of, well, why are we paying this vendor for no reason, and help avoid your gift of public funds issues. It also is going to help you avoid later challenges by the contractor themselves. Let's say something goes wrong, and like Mike was saying, the contract, there hasn't been memorialized the new terms of when you're going to pay and when and how and what milestones they need to meet. That's not written down, and so that's going to be much harder to enforce if it's not there and approved by your board. It also gives you an opportunity in bringing these items to the board to collaborate with your cabinet and speak to, for example, we know of many contracts that impact the special education side, and it gives you an opportunity as a CBO or on the financial side to communicate with your instructional services person and say to them, this is what we're thinking about doing. We probably will continue these payments, but how can we change this structure or talk to this vendor about making sure that services can still be provided as much as possible. And that's really what the next portion covers, is when you're having these conversations around payments, it really provides an opportunity to not just document, but to make sure there's a much clearer understanding and clearer terms as to how everybody is going to approach the project going forward. And so with payment terms, we have a couple of things to consider on these two slides. I think the most important is if you are doing any new MOU or change order or formal written document, or even the letter that goes to the contractor to say, yes, we're going to continue to pay you, but you want to acknowledge the current and albeit temporary situation that we're in. And say, due to these very unique circumstances, we're going to temporarily address payment issues in this manner. And also, be sure to confirm what the district's going to pay. And again, this is your opportunity to potentially tie those payments to continued milestones or continued purpose. And I think one of the most critical bullet point on this slide is to make sure to clarify what the contractor is still going to provide, even though circumstances may have changed due to the coronavirus. So for example, if the contractor can continue to provide the same level of service, then you make that crystal clear that the expectation is that because of the exemption from executive order, for example, your public works project is going to continue as expected and as on certain timelines. But where impossible, so where, for example, the school closures make it impossible to render services, your special ed, your busing, that you were expecting to get, you still have a conversation to try to make sure that you can work with the vendor to provide different levels of services that are trying to maximize the value of what you're still getting and really bring value back towards what your pre-closure levels were. And Mike and I will talk about that a little bit more with an example. Another great point that Mike has shared with me is when you're memorializing these payment terms, yes, we want to be the good guys and we want to give some of these contractors a break and pay them up front to try to make sure that they can stay operational and can pay their employees. But there's certain things and hooks to that we can put in the contract language or whatever you're memorializing that says, all right, we're doing this, but you're going to provide us with payroll records to make sure that you're still employing your drivers or your specialists, your special education providers, so that we know that the money is going towards the use that we expect it is. The other great point that Mike has made is to make sure that there's no double dipping. So whether it's in a contract or a agreement that relieves it, we did one that relieves a tenant for their rent for a time being. But we say in the contract, yes, we're going to do this, but if you receive other funds to help with your rent situation, there will be some reimbursement required, which really just avoids the double dipping issue. So we're gonna, that's a lot to throw at you as far as contracting. So we're gonna use a few examples to illustrate what we're talking about here. And really the examples also highlight some of the nuances between public works contracts, your construction contracts, things like that, and services contracts, busing, special ed providers, things like that. So there are some nuances there, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. As far as public works contracts, generally what we're seeing is things are going along pretty smoothly. I know there's a few of you on this who are thinking, oh, not mine, and there are exceptions, but it seems like because the essential services and essential construction projects are allowed to continue, for the most part, the work is continued. And so under public works, typically vendors get paid as the work is performed. And so because the work is continuing, the payments go right along with that. But I think if you do have vendors come back and ask you for more money or talk about delays, and you can give them more time, but I think in that case, still try to get some clarity and certainty about, all right, we're going to continue to pay you, you're going to continue to try to do the work, but here are the milestones that we expect you to hit because it's so critical to our project. That example I used with new school construction and students coming back, that's going to be particularly important to have those conversations with your contractors. We did get a question last time about new projects, and again, mostly we're outside the scope of that. We're talking about current contracts, but it is helpful to look at your bid language and your documents that are going out for any new projects to see if your public works are covered and covered by language that's going to address delays, address termination, all the contract terms we talked about on the other slide. It's helpful to revisit your bid documents and make sure that's all being hit before you go out and pursue a new essential project. And really, especially in the public works, and I know Mike shares this sentiment, it's making sure to review each contract on an individual basis and what you have in front of you. Turning to the other side, which gets a little bit more interesting and complicated, is the services contracts. And so the example we've pulled is one we're hearing a lot, and many of you have already navigated this, which is your transportation services agreement. And I think it's absolutely right in light of the new laws to, even if buses are not running and moving kids and operating in the normal sense, is to have this thought of, well, when we open back up, we're going to need those services immediately. And so that is a really, really critical point. But of course, we need to balance that against the budget concerns and being fiscally responsible. And so this list of items is just things to consider that, yes, you're going to continue to pay, but what are you not willing to pay for? Things that are not being incurred because the buses are not running, like fuel and certain types of maintenance and oil changes because the buses are not operational. That might be something you want to look at and negotiate and say, well, why should we have to pay that? We're willing to keep your folks employed. We're willing to pay for your labor, but these operational costs that you're not incurring may not be as big of a deal. We also recommend that for any services that are still going to be rendered, to keep a service log to identify, all right, what projects or what services were still able to be provided, even if students are not being transported. And it's also time to get creative. You can have credits for services that, you know, you may not have services right now, but you're continuing to pay, and those services get tacked on to the next few months when things are operational. Mike, quickly, I know you have a great point about alternative services too, just to get creative for if for example, busing can't be used for students. What are some of the other ways you're hearing about school districts use those?
Well, they're using them to pick up and deliver instructional materials to neighborhoods, to say a designated parking lot, especially for districts that have a great distance between where their kids live and where they may be served. And so instead of, if you will, the Pony Express or the US Mail Service, they're using their buses and their drivers to deliver that. Same with picking up and delivering distance learning devices, electronic devices. Also seen buses outfitted with Wi-Fi, where they're actually parked out then in neighborhoods to provide access for distance learning in some of our communities. But I think critical here to this list here is don't do anything that would prevent you from using them for an alternative service, right? You just get back to the documentation and this idea about log. And if you are going to pay people, which was the intent here of the executive order, then make sure you're not paying for a bunch of new people. So look for payroll lists from the 3 months prior. Look for a certified payroll list or something like that to ensure that the names of people being paid. Also, some of our vendors may be small business or medium-sized businesses that benefit from federal aid, stimulus aid and other federal protections. So you also want to protect yourself so there's no double dipping here. And Kelly, you mentioned this earlier on an earlier slide, I think, but the idea that if they get federal aid, then they return to you anything you paid that didn't have a service attached to it.
Mm-hmm.
And beyond the example of transportation, you all are familiar with a whole host of programs and services that you contract out for. I think probably the next number one issue other than transportation is non-public school, non-public agencies. For many of our NPS, NPA providers, their clients are only school districts. And their economic stability and vitality to return to work when you need them is dependent upon your continued pay. And so maybe it's an alternative pay. Maybe it's that creative way that Kelly alluded to with credits. We'll pay now and you'll give us more hours later when things stabilize. But that's probably the next largest group. And all these principles that are on this list for transportation apply to those NPS, NPA vendors equally as well. Many of which may still be providing service, especially if they were one-on-one NPA types of services. Children may still, consistent with their IEP, be actually you've facilitated accessing those services to continue on a one-to-one where there can be some safe medical considerations and distancing there.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Mike. And I know we're going over a little bit, but we wanted to provide you with those examples because the services contracts is really something that continues to be pretty murky. But at the core of it, it's that balance that we've talked about of wanting to continue payments where you can so that these vendors are around when we need them and when everything opens up again, balanced against this idea of asking the right questions and keeping fiscal responsibility in mind. So given our time, we are going to look at the questions in the chat box and review those and give some thought to those. And we will continue to compile our FAQ piece that will be pushed out to our registrants as well as on our website. Again, if you did catch at the beginning, this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available for later viewing. And if you do have a moment, feel free to put in the comments any future topics that you may want us to address on later webinars. We expect the updated FAQ piece to come out in about a week or so with some initial answers. And again, we just really appreciate you spending time with us today. We know you have busy days and busy mornings, and we wish you the best. We thank you for your continued service and commitment on these issues, and we just hope you all take care and stay safe. Thank you.